Hi, welcome. Thanks for coming. My name is Philip Bump. I am a columnist at the Washington Post. I had the pleasure of meeting, should I call you professor, doctor? How fancy do I need to be?
I mean, you can call me Thomas,
Oh,
but yeah,
that-
Professor Zeitzoff.
That's also my 6-year-old's name, so that's a little
Okay.
confusing for me. So, Professor, I had the privilege of speaking with the professor when I was working on a book about the end of the baby boom and the future of politics. And so we had a good conversation, and then he happily let me know that he had written his book, which, of course, as you are all aware, is called Nasty Politics, The Logic of Insults, Threats, and Incitement, which, as you are all cognizant, is a theme in politics these days, both here and abroad. So I had a chance to look at the book, and Thomas invited me here to speak with him about it. And so my goal is to ask you questions, which elicit a decent conversation,
Okay.
and then we'll talk for a while, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. And of course, I will allow you to introduce yourself, but I gather that probably you're well known here, better than myself.
I wouldn't say well known. I would say medium known, I think is the term.
Medium rare known. Sure.
Yes. So I'm Professor Thomas Zeitzoff. I am a professor over in Justice Law and Criminology in the School of Public Affairs. I study, teach, and do research on political violence. I see some of my students out here, so thank you for coming. And I'm really excited to be here for a great discussion on what, unfortunately, I think is a timely topic. I wish it was more historical. So,
right. Yeah. Well, I feel like we'll cover some history as well, right? So let's start with, and this was the first thing that struck me when I saw the book, was the word nasty, the choice of the word nasty. So why that word? How do you use that word as a descriptor for the trends that you're seeing in politics?
Yeah, so I take nasty politics to basically be an umbrella term for insults and kind of accusations, which we see as pretty common in American politics, and then all the way up to the more, what I would say is the more concerning, the more threatening kinds of rhetoric, and in some cases, actual political violence. So it's at the low end, we have insults and accusations. Then we have like intimidating statements. These are threats to throw opponents in jail, investigate them. And then the most concerning, which is calls to violence or incitement. And those are also the rarest.
Right. And it's interesting. I mean, the word it's obviously a good umbrella word, but it's interesting in that you use it to encompass things ranging from, Donald Trump saying, so-and-so is a whatever, right? Right.
Yes.
The kids have left, but you understand how you could fill in those blanks.
Yeah.
But also, for example, we saw yesterday the piece we were just discussing by McKay Coppins about Mitt Romney describing how in the wake of January 6th, there were senators who were coming up to him and saying, I would like to vote to convict Donald Trump, but I'm worried for my safety. So it's just the delineation there between sort of something fairly innocuous and something obviously very dangerous. You're covering a lot of territory here. Is there an important distinction that you draw, or is there a reason that you encompass it all under this one umbrella?
I think that's a good question. Like, do insults have a lot to do with incitement? And what I would say is yes. And the reason why we want to kind of cover them under a similar umbrella is these traditionally have been studied, right? In American politics, it's been talked about. Incivility was kind of the big watchword used for a long time, right? Like Joe Wilson yelling out, "You lied," to Barack Obama. This has been talked about. Mudslinging, right? These are like those classic sort of dark arts of nasty campaign ads. But I think the concern is that, and what I've shown in the data and in the book is that these lower level things, right, they're part of this broader phenomenon. And so when we see instances of incitement, we tend to see it come with a bunch of insults, conspiracy theories, and accusations and threats. So there is this kind of stepping and ratcheting up of rhetoric that we see. And so, yes, calling an opponent a jerk and saying, I wouldn't trust them to be dog catcher, we may not be as concerned about that. But when we start calling opponents animals, terrorists, right, it sort of is part of a broader phenomenon.
Okay, so let's take a step back. Let's talk let's talk about why this subject. How was it that you decided this was something that you wanted to? I mean, doing a book is a lot of work. Why was this a thing that you decided was worth that amount of attention? Yeah,
so I think it's a great question, an important one, and one I asked myself many times when I had to rewrite the book multiple times. So I got interested in this. I study political violence, and I study most of my research. I'm not, I'm not an Americanist, as they would say. I don't traditionally studied American politics. I did most of my work in Ukraine, in Turkey, in Israel, where nasty rhetoric, populist rhetoric, name calling, and actual violence was part and parcel of politics. And I think around 2015, 2016, I started seeing a lot of that rhetoric reflected back here in the US. And I got interested in this, and I was setting out to write a book about, well, here is how nasty politics and rhetoric is actually persuasive, right? It's disgusting, it's distasteful, it's, the dark arts of politics, but it works. And one of the things that happened as I started doing more and more of this research was I found out that voters actually don't like it, right? They'll say in surveys, you'll do focus groups. There's actually quite a bit of data that even among Trump's own supporters, they reduce their support for him when they use this nasty rhetoric. So it raises a puzzle, right? Voters say they don't like it. They actually reduce support, and I take them at their word, but there's evidence this isn't just voters lying and being insincere. They don't like this, but yet we see politicians use it, and we see them use it in some ways to affect, positive, at least for them, positive change and get support. So what's going on? That's the puzzle that kind of drove me to this, is to understand what's going on. If it's not persuasive, what is nasty politics doing? And is the US, kind of the subtext of this? And I think it's related to a lot of other works like Levitsky and Way and How Democracies Die, that we tended to think of the US as different, right? We're a stable democracy. We have, norms, all these guardrails, right? And I think what unfortunately we found is that the US is not that different. I mean, Juan Lin's the famous political scientist. He said, presidential systems such as the US tend to be unstable. We have a separation of powers, and not like in the UK or in Israel where there's a constitutional crisis and you can call an election and government collapses. Here, in presidential systems, essentially there's no out. And so Juan Lin said they were famously prone to coups, the US notwithstanding. And I think a lot of us are starting to reevaluate what we thought we would know about American politics. And so that's the kind of second through line, was how different is the US?
I mean, it's hard to have these conversations because it's hard to be sort of academic. I mean, you're an academic, so it's probably easier for you, but it's hard to be academic about these things because, we aren't simply talking about, I have made this, trenchant observation that Donald Trump uses. I mean, these have real implications, right? Mm-hmm. And obviously one of the things, and we might as well address it at the top, is, I spend all day writing about politics. And so I'm very attuned to what's happening in politics, probably more so than is healthy or useful for any human being. Yes. But how exceptional is this moment? Well, when we look at the, obviously, and we've had this conversation, you shared this graph of the amount of mentions of nasty politics in the New York Times articles over time. Mm-hmm. And you can see this big spike in the 1860s and then a lull, and then you can see a big spike again in the Donald Trump era. And so the question then becomes, to what extent should we be alarmed by this trend? How bad are things in the United States relative to either where they were or where other places are?
So that's a really tough question, I think, to answer. So on my notes, I have two data points. One was the point that you made, is that when we look at nasty politics, and this is kind of using data from the New York Times, historically stretching all the way back to 1851, we see there are two masses, this giant kind of U shape. There's this increase in the 1850s leading up to the Civil War, when we had brawls on the floor of Congress, the caning of Sumner, the Congressional Brawl of 1858, which was only stopped when somebody's hairpiece fell off, right? And then we go, and then it's kind of flat, and there's some upticks here and there, and then it's the election of Trump. We see this massive acceleration. That's one data point. The second thing, and we're talking about the article in The Atlantic that McKay Coppins came on his interview with Mitt Romney, and there's a lot of discussion about sort of what Republicans are saying privately about Trump, like why they wouldn't convict him. But I thought, to me, one of the most concerning things, and Seth Maskett, who's a political scientist at Denver, highlighted this, is Mitt Romney, the former leader of the Republican Party, ran for president a little over 10 years ago, and he is paying $5,000 a day in security, which roughly close to $2 million, to basically avoid getting murdered, in some sense, by other supporters within his party. So that's, I would say, those are my two data points. So I'm not saying, and I think there have been some scholars who have said we're headed towards civil war or other things, and I think that sells a lot of books. But between civil war and, I don't know, we haven't really had it in this country, but maybe like Denmark, there's a lot of space, and I think that concerns a lot of folks who follow political violence. And it's interesting that you bring this up because, as I said, I was not traditionally like a scholar of American politics, and I remember after the election of Trump, I was with some colleagues, and a lot of the people who studied American politics basically said the institutions will hold, right? The institutions will hold. And there were a lot of people, myself and others, who study political violence and said, we've seen this show outside the US where leaders make these promises to jail opponents, where they, employ street politics and armed folks, right? It may hold, but I don't think that's a safe bet just to say the institutions will hold. They're not self-enforcing. So yeah, your question as to where we're headed, I don't know. I think there's a lot of uncertainty, but I would say the trend lines aren't necessarily great either.
Yeah, fair. The Romney article was interesting, and again, McKay Coppins in the Atlantic. If you haven't read it, it's definitely worth a read. The thing that struck me from it, and I wrote about this today, was the fact that not only is it the case that Mitt Romney is having to defend himself, but it's not just January 6th, right? I mean, obviously January 6th was a signal moment, and one of those things that when in 100 years, some academic from American university is sitting here and talking about history, it was going to point to.
Yep.
But then you have, for example, Lindsey Graham getting on TV, just a casual Fox News conversation last August 2022, and saying, if they convict Donald Trump, there's going to be riots in the street. And what's that? That is an appeal to the threat of political violence in order to affect some particular political outcome. In that case, not having Donald Trump be indicted, right? And so when you talk about the patterns that you see, to what extent are there these periods of latency in which, it's not always a coup, but there is, an elevated temperature, to use the metaphor, and how are things like that resolved one way or the other?
Yeah. So
I'm trying to make you forecast the future, and I'm going to get you to do it eventually.
I'll point to, so the two other countries that I talk about in my book are Ukraine and Israel. And we're talking about, what's going to happen, et cetera. And one of the things that we know is coming down the pike are the trials, emphasis on plural, of Donald Trump. And so if we think of other places where they've had former leaders on trial, Brazil with Lula, but one place, and that I know pretty well, and I spent a lot of time there before COVID, and especially before the war in Ukraine happened, is Ukraine. And in the mid 2000s, in the early 2010s, Yulia Tymoshenko, who was the prime minister, she was the leader of the kind of pro-European bloc within Ukraine. She lost the election to Viktor Yanukovych. He was later, deposed in, a popular uprising. For, folks, conspiracy theorists, they would say it was a US-backed coup d'etat. That's not true.
He was the one who was aided by Paul Manafort as well.
Yes. Again, the connections. Yeah, here we go. Paul Manafort, Trump's, very short-lived campaign advisor. But so her trial period, like when she was on trial, was where I would say Ukrainian politics, even before the Euromaidan, were kind of at a boiling point. There were assassination attempts. There were full-on legislative riots. Like if you look back in 2012, there was a debate about the language, the Russian language, whether it would be elevated to Ukrainian in some of the parts of Ukraine. And there was basically a full-on melee. Like it looked like something out of, I don't know, Real Madrid, Barcelona, like the wildest things you can see in politics. And so there, I think the concern is that when you have, leaders on trial, or in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, there have been 5 elections in the past, 4 or 5 years in Israel, and there's been a ton of instability. There's been, 32 weeks of straight protests. You talk to my friends and colleagues who are academics over there, they don't really recognize the country, the security services and other people. You have people in the military who are saying this is, a really worrisome fact, that, and this is all because Netanyahu wants to avoid going on trial for corruption, right? And so I think the concern is, like, nasty politics has always been part and parcel of politics, but it's usually been the folks from the periphery who do it because they want attention, right? This is the McCarthy, I'm going to make a career out of, scandal, et cetera. And a lot of people are going to maybe be caught in the crossfire. But the concern is when it reaches the core party leaders who start doing it, promoting it, and especially when those leaders are threatened, that's when it's, unfortunately, buckle up your seatbelt up. That's the really concerning part.
What that reminds me of is I had a conversation with someone in the middle of the Trump administration, in which we were talking about conspiracy theories and the extent to which conspiracy theorism had sort of taken root as part of the national political conversation. And this person pointed out to me that usually conspiracy theories are, to your point around nasty politics, they are tools of those on the outside to try and affect change from the outside and or, either take down power or assume power. But Donald Trump was the person in the foremost position of authority in the United States. And he was, one of the most prominent conspiracy theorists that exists and continues to be to this day, in part because his politics are predicated on this oppositionality to, the establishment and so on and so forth. But this question, and we've talked briefly about this separately, but to what extent, I'm gonna sort of reveal my priors here. I am of the firm belief that Donald Trump was successful in 2016, not because he had this unique take on politics, but because he was very tuned to the fringe rights rhetoric. And so he was reading Breitbart and watching Fox News, and he came onto the campaign trail and he started saying the things that the Republican base was hearing. And they weren't hearing from Jeb Bush because Jeb Bush was traditional and he wasn't going to say the nonsense you were reading on Breitbart, but Trump did. And everyone said, this guy's a truth teller. This guy is accurate, right? And so he elevated that, and that became his brand. And so that gave him political power, and he was successful, obviously. But it raises the question, this is sort of one of the recurring questions that exists, is what happens when Trump is gone? Trump will be gone at some point. He loses in 2024, he gets hit by a meteor, who knows what happens? He'll be gone at some point. You have to say it in a nice way, but what happens once that occurs? To what extent can we expect this trend of nastiness to continue?
Yeah, I think this is also a big question, right? Is how much was Trump just reflecting things that, Republican maybe elites hadn't coalesced around among people who were sort of, they hadn't really taken the temperature of what the activists in their party really wanted. And Trump did it and found out, they don't really care that much about tax cuts and deep policy. They want to, as Adam Serwer would maybe say, inflict pain on the people they feel are, responsible for their situation or what they feel is a threat to America. And so whenever I get asked this question about what's going to happen, I return to the Honorable Jerry Falwell Jr., former president of Liberty University. You can look at why he's no longer the president. And he had a tweet back. Yeah, he had a tweet back in 2018 that I think sort of outlines I think a lot of folks' view on Trump. And he said, conservatives and Christians need to stop electing quote unquote nice guys. They may make great Christian leaders, but the US needs street fighters like Donald Trump at every level of government because the liberal fascist Dems are playing for keeps and many Republican leaders are a bunch of wimps. And so I think that view, that deep view that folks on the right, that they are under assault or other, and it's sort of the resurgence in Christian nationalism, that kids are being indoctrinated and other things. I don't think that goes away at all. I think there's concerning things happening in a lot of some of the state houses. I mean, you see some of what's going on in like Montana's politics or in Wyoming, in some of these places that I think, unfortunately, I don't think, Trump will, decline. And then this is the high watermark. I think, until there's this deep story that a lot of Republican activists say that they are under threat culturally from, people like at this university here. And, we're in DC, we care a lot deeply about politics, but the view is that this kind of institution and folks like us are threatening to their way of life and needs to be dealt with. I mean, and this is what's going on with Chris Rufo and his, rhetoric, Moms for Liberty and other things, some of these grassroots organizations. And until that story does not become the dominant narrative within the party and within Republican activist elites, things may change, right? But I don't see a, ebb here.
Right. So the thesis of my book is that the scale of the baby boom generation.
Can you show it for everybody? It's right there. I see.
I'd be happy to. I did bring it. I was actually instructed to bring it. Just it's not me just being
fantastic.
It's very colorful, if nothing else. It's worth the purchase just on that. But the thesis of my book is the baby boom generation emerges in the aftermath of World War II. And the easiest way to frame it is in 1945, there's 140 million people in America. And then over the next 19 years, 76 million babies were born, right? So more than 50% of the entire population in America is born from 1946 to 64. And they're all the same age range. It's not like you have a bunch of people of all different ages. These are all people under the age of 20. And, you know, if you take the year in which there were the most births, 1957, and add 65, you get 2022. So we are at the peak era of baby boomers hitting retirement. Baby boomers are also much more heavily white than other Americans. Are much less likely to identify as LGBTQ. There are all these differentiators which overlap with politics. They're less likely to have college education, for example. So one of the theses of my book is that part of the reason we're seeing these tensions at this moment is this transition of power that overlaps heavily with the baby boom and generation, not entirely. And Chris Rufo's, you know, my age or younger, right? Our age or younger. But there is a market for it. Right. There's a market for Donald Trumpism. There's a market for people to say, you're right, America is changing in a way that is different than it was when you were growing up in 1968. Well, that year, 1965, say, right? Yeah. To what extent do you think that's possible? To what extent is my book wrong or correct? Is the short version. I'm not offended. It's written. Nothing I can do about it.
No, I think that's right. I mean, there's the demographics of this. I mean, for sure, you know, you look at a Trump rally, it looks very different. You know, I wouldn't say than a Biden rally, but maybe than other rallies that have happened. And I mean, I think the other interesting thing, and this was something that Romney said in his retirement, is he also, you know, called out like the Biden and like, you know, basically said like step aside, age, new leaders. And there is, I mean, there's been stuff written about, you know, the gerontocracy, as folks would say. And I think you're right in the sense that there is definitely, you know, Time magazine makes, you know, bank every few years running a cover story on the generation gaps, right? But I think there is something about the baby boom identity. I've talked to my parents about that. I sent them your book and it was like, I don't need to hear this. My parents are open-minded, but not about that. But I think the one concern though, like a concern would be from somebody who studies political violence, is that, you know, the most dangerous, you know, kind of identity or most dangerous time is precisely this, you know, power shifting, when groups fear that they are in decline and want to do something about it. So, you know, you may be right that, you know, this is, you know, the high water mark for the baby boomers and there's this shift that's happening. But, you know, from that shift to, you know, I don't know, calm politics. Right. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know. And I don't think that's linear.
It's like a weather front. You're going to get storms on you. Right.
Storms, I mean, or you get a tornado. I don't know. And I think that's an open question. And I think the other thing too, right, is that the parties are not static, right? They shift, right? They shift around and they change, and there are new coalitions and new people enter the marketplace. And I don't know what that looks like. You know, I think that's one thing that Trump did, is there was a realignment, and it's across education and other things. And I think the other thing that's coming and will be really interesting is a lot of, you know, we live in the suburbs now, my wife and I, and you want to talk about, you know, generational politics, talk to, you know, older homeowners versus young homeowners. And that's a fun one. Anyways, but yeah.
Okay. So I am in my hunt for a note of optimism here. I'm going to try again here. So obviously part of the reason that Trumpism is strong is Trump. Right. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, I take your point about Falwell, and I take your point broadly about this current that exists, and I obviously don't dispute that. But there is a crystallizing factor here. January 6th happened because Trump said, come to DC, and then gave a speech and said, go there. Right. Well, I mean, at least the first part, that is indisputable. Right.
Yeah.
So Trump is gone. If there isn't then someone who's able to seize the mantle, to what extent does that potentially at least diffuse things? Or is it you know, people often draw the analogy of the Troubles in Northern Ireland and how it's just these sort of scattershot acts of violence that are, you know, undertaken by, you know, small groups or individuals. Not to introduce, you know, pessimism into my search for optimism here, but, you know, to what extent is it dependent upon at least having a figurehead? And then, you know, again, based on what you see elsewhere as well.
Yeah, no, I think leadership definitely matters. I mean, I mean, part of the reason, you know, leaders get to be leaders are they're effective at managing political coalitions, mobilizing people. And we've seen that Trump is really good at that, and especially good at that in a way that's effective, particularly in a Republican primary. He's not so good at that in the general election. I mean, this is the argument that Nikki Haley has tried to make when she's been making other arguments that would seem to cut against that case. But, you know, her argument is that we've lost elections because of him. And I think there's good evidence that that's the case, right? I think it's the problem is the two-step, right? It's how do you get past the primary? So I guess a couple notes of optimism is that I think a lot of this is fundamentally it's an elite phenomenon. So people want to talk about, red state versus blue states. And like most people don't follow politics that closely. I mean, pop culture, Love is Blind, whatever you want to talk about, Taylor Swift, right? I mean, USA Today, I think, right, they're getting they have a Taylor Swift reporter, right? So I think it suggests that politics, doesn't rule everybody. But so if this is fundamentally an elite phenomenon, the question is how do you change the incentives for elites? And that's I think the tricky part that nobody really has the magic bullet on. I think in a system where you don't have two parties, right? In other places, what has happened is you've had kind of massive sort of coalitions, like pro-democracy coalitions form to keep out, like, for instance, in Germany, people like the AfD who are in the far right, right? The problem is what's happened is that we have two parties, and one of the parties has been taken over by a right-wing movement. And that means that it's kind of one or the other. And, I think the concern that people who favor democracy, and are concerned about democracy, if every election becomes a referendum on democracy, that's hard, right? That means the stakes are that high. And if you lose, oh no. That's the pessimistic side. The optimistic side, I don't know, I would say my one optimistic side is that there's a lot of uncertainty in politics. I mean, if we would go back to, 2012, we would say it was the Obama coalition forever. Go back to 2000, it was compassionate conservatism and George Bush. So these things, there's a ton of uncertainty, and you're trying to get me up here to look like a fool in 4 years. No, I'm kidding. But I don't know. I think there's a lot of uncertainty.
I mean, I would love for your book to be relevant in 4 years, right? I mean,
at least
in the United States, right? At least in the United States. You should read the book. It's a good book. I'm just saying, it would be nice if nasty politics weren't a salient issue in American politics.
Yes, I agree.
Perhaps I said that poorly at the outset.
Yeah.
I'm not here to be like, oh, I don't know about the book. Okay. So, but I do want to come back to this point, because one of the things that is, I think, worth asking is, why is this more of a phenomenon on the right these days in the United States? I looked today as I was writing about Mitt Romney, went back and looked at research and polling. A PRI does polling, and they ask, do you feel as though violence may become necessary in order to affect political change? 30% of Republicans say yes, 10% of Democrats. The ADL looked at actual incidents of extremist violence, and there was something like 150 deaths over the past 5 years have been linked to right-wing violence, and 3 that have been linked to left-wing violence. Why is this a function of the right in America at this point?
I mean, so this is
largely.
Yeah. So I think there's, if we were talking about terrorism in political violence in the 60s, we'd be talking about the left, right? If we were going back to the 20s, we'd be talking about, anarchist groups. And in the, late 19th century, we'd be talking about, like syndicalists and the Pinkertons. We have all these things. So I think there is somewhat of, wave to these sorts of things. There are cycles to it. I believe at least a little bit is sort of Pippa Norris's argument. She's at Harvard, and her argument is that essentially we're going through a backlash to the cultural changes that happened in the 60s. So shifts around race, gender, and sexual orientation, and that this is part of the kind of broader backlash to that. And I think those things have mobilized, at least, people on the left definitely care about these things, but I think the people on the right care about these very intensely, and particularly the people within those coalitions, right? I don't think it's Moms for Liberty is necessarily like going to poll really, really, really well, right? But they have motivated folks. And I think, it's the same thing with the violence on the right, is that they're more motivated right now to commit these kinds of things because they feel, again, that they're under siege and other things. I think if you were, again, doing this in the 60s or 30s, we'd have a different topic, and you can go back and look at political science, and they would talk about like alienation in urban America and what's wrong with the radical left students, right? And it was just a very different time. So
I take your point. I guess, though, beyond the fact, and you're right, when we look at what was going on in the 60s and 70s, I mean, the scale of political violence in the 60s and 70s, I think people today don't really appreciate. It was far, far worse on a day-to-day basis than it is currently. And it was largely from the left. And obviously there were lots of reasons for that, Vietnam War, et cetera, right? But I guess I don't really, and obviously I have a thesis in my book which overlaps with race and gender and so on and so forth. But I guess I'm not clear on, and I don't know that there is a clear answer to it. But I don't know how it is that sense of aggrievement and being under siege is resolved beyond just, I don't even know what the beyond just is. Like what in your experience of seeing these sorts of patterns elsewhere, how do things like that resolve?
I mean, so one argument would be time, right? But a lot of times people would point to sort of like cross-cutting cleavages. So this is what folks on the left would point out, is there's a ton of evidence that like being a member of a union or other things has all these positive benefits, and that it raises class consciousness, right? It increases cross-race solidarity, it reduces prejudice, right? So that, to people on the left, and generally speaking, we think that's a good thing, right? I'll point to something outside the US, is, Ukraine. And I think, I would not wish, I have a lot of friends there. I would not wish ever to have to deal with what ordinary Ukrainians are dealing with, like going to bomb shelters, having loved ones, being abducted, having to serve in a really grueling, brutal, war of attrition. But Ukrainian politics has changed fundamentally since the war, right? I mean, it's hard to think about it, but in 2019, like Zelensky, by people of like the Ukrainian nationalists, the pro-Europeans, they saw him as like a sleeper candidate who was basically beholden to oligarchs. He's this comedian who comes in, who the name of his political party is essentially the name of his show that he was on, about a comedian who becomes. I'm sorry, did you? Yeah, no, yeah.
That's
no, so
true,
yeah, we'll come back. Yeah,
the show's on Netflix for what it's worth.
Yeah, serving to the people, it's great. And so he basically, rides this wave. And a lot of the far right in Ukraine, they were like, he's Jewish, right? Ethnically, he speaks Russian. His Ukrainian was not great. He actually took Ukrainian language lessons after the war, and he was mocked for it for a little bit. But now he kind of embodies, I think, the new sort of Ukrainian political identity. I mean, he held Rosh Hashanah dinner in the Ukrainian presidential palace. I mean, that's to me is a very different Ukraine than the one I visited before. And so I think there are things and instances where events do coalesce and shake up these identities, shake up these cleavages, and we see a shifting of political coalitions. Now, I hope it's not war. I hope it's something else. I hope that there's some other kind of change that happens. And because I do think political coalitions, aren't enduring. And I think as your book would point out, is as these demographics change, right? And there's already people within the Republican Party who are thinking about sort of these things that, okay, well, how do we shift, right?
Yeah, I mean, the example that I would use in terms of the demographic shift and that I use in the book is, in the wake of Mitt Romney's loss in 2012, the Republican Party embarked on this big, okay, what are we going to do? We got to turn things around here. And one of their solutions was, okay, we got to do a better job of reaching out to non-white voters, black voters, Hispanic voters. And then Trump came along and was like, or we could really go hard on the white voters. And that's what they ended up doing. And now, after the 22 midterms, when they did badly, what does Ronna McDaniel say? She says, we got to figure out what we're going to do. And one of the plans is, well, we got to do a better job of reaching out to non-white voters. So we'll see if this time it catches. Okay. So setting all that aside, I want to come back to one of the points that you raised in the introduction, which I have a hard time grappling with. And so I'm going to set it up by using an example. So Donald Trump is good at getting Republicans elected. He's not good at getting himself or Republicans elected in the general election, right? And there was actually research that I wrote about last week, which showed that he was generally a boost of something like 12, 13 points to primary candidates and a drag of about 1.5 points on general election candidates. And the reason for that, in part, one of the theories is that basically Donald Trump comes to your town and is boosting Republican for the general election, and all the Democrats are like, oh, I gotta go vote, right? I gotta go vote for the Democrat, make sure this guy wins. So to some extent, when you say that nasty politics doesn't actually work as a motivator for people, which, again, we've been in politics long enough to understand that very few people hold that view, right? Not like many people are convinced by data in the first place in general, but people don't really accept that. Is it potentially also the case that it triggers some sort of negative reaction that is actually outweighs the fact that they feel kind of dirty about embracing that sort of that approach to politics?
Yeah, I think that's a really nice setup to sort of how I think about it, is that, a lot of folks, a couple, blocks away from here would say it works, right? And they would say, and I thought so too, is that it's persuasive. You're basically appealing to people's lowest common denominator. It's persuading people. But I don't think that's kind of what's happening, right? Is yes, you're getting attention. I mean, that's the currency, and that's a big important currency in politics, right? And then you're signaling toughness. I mean, that was sort of Trump's thing. So there are candidates who are willing, and under certain circumstances, right? If you think that, the sky is falling, right, you're maybe willing to trade off a little bit of that likability, this politician is somebody I want to grab a beer with or lunch with, right? Versus, oh, this person's a little, rough around the edges, but maybe we need that now. And so I think there's this trade-off that happens. And that's how I sort of see it, is there are candidates that are willing to sacrifice the likability, to be, being perceived as a nice, kind person to basically say, well, no, I'm tough. And so it's the same, the kind of metaphor I would make is, it's, if you're going through a nasty divorce, do you want the kind, nice divorce attorney, or do you want the nasty one? And that's, it depends how bad the divorce is, I guess, is what you would say.
Okay, that's I'm not sure what to do with that. It's my wife's birthday today, so I have to be very cautious. So I do want to say, though, that one of the undergirding aspects there is the fact that American politics is the gerrymandering exists, right?
Yep.
And so as I was writing my book, I spoke with a consultant in Florida who pointed out, and this is a guy who does Republican politics, and he pointed out, I can't get good candidates to run because they don't want to be thrown into this maelstrom where they have to suckle at Donald Trump's teat and, figure out how they're going to appeal to that crowd and engage in those sorts of politics. And just the tenor of it means that the people who engage in it are of a particular, a predilection, if you will. But then you also have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's one of the best known members of Congress. She has the speaker's ear. She is in an incredibly safe district in Northwest Georgia. She runs, beyond the fringe into the sort of gauzy area of surreality is where she operates from, and there's nothing you can do about it, right? Because she gets all the attention, she gets all the money. No one's going to challenge her from no one can challenge from the right. No one's going to challenge her from the middle because they're not going to be successful. But you have a lot of districts like that across the United States. And then you build up these caucuses like the House Freedom Caucus. How does that then influence us? The fact that not only is there, perhaps there's not value in that sort of politics, but once you get this embedded nature in these gerrymandered districts in which a party celebrates and rewards that kind of activity, and then they're there, how does that complicate things?
Yeah. So I think that's a really important part of this phenomenon that kind of gets overlooked, is sort of the indirect effects of this kind of politics, is how it influences people who are willing to run. Like we talked about, Mitt Romney having to pay, $2 million a year for security. Who's willing to run for that? I think in Israel, if you look at, Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party, it is very different from when he started. Anybody who was perceived as a threat, they were kind of ousted. And if you look in Ukraine, there was a similar dynamic when Ukrainian politics were pretty bare knuckled. You actually had parties basically employing UFC fighters, boxers as like members of their party lists. So I think, the point, though, you made about this sort of gerrymandered safe districts, what do we do about it, is something that Julia Azari has made, I think, a lot in her argument for how we got Trump. Is she basically said the problem that we have is we have strong partisanship. So these parties are very, people are very strongly attached to parties, and they're willing to vote, for that party down the line, especially the activists. But we have weak parties, so they're not screening out. That's a role for parties to basically say, we're not going to let somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene run because she may, get them money from some of the activist base, but she costs them nationally. I mean, I think that's pretty clear. And so the fact that parties, in the US kind of have these, don't weed out some of these candidates, I think is sort of a function of our politics.
So we're getting close to time when we do Q&A. I do want to ask you one more question here, which is, as I was reading your book, I was struck by your mentioning that it doesn't matter if the false claims are true, or the false claims are true, if the nasty claims are true. I spend a lot of my time pointing out that claims that are made by politicians are erroneous. I like to think there's value to that, or that at least shift, and perhaps it does outside the context of this. But why do you say that it doesn't, that the measure of nastiness, and it doesn't matter whether or not the assertions that are being made are true.
So first of all, I'll just, I think, so what you're saying is basically when I have my little, my typology or kind of schema of like talking about accusations and conspiracy theories, that I didn't count which was, I didn't try to adjudicate which was false and which was not. And there were two reasons for that. The simple one is it's actually pretty hard. And I have a ton of admiration for journalists and other people who, PolitiFact, other folks who engage in debunking. That's very hard. But the second thing is, I think because of the way partisanship works, and if you were to ask, Trump supporters or other folks, who support Trump, how they view the charges and the cases against him, they will view it through the partisan lenses of, well, look, they're out to get him. This is a witch hunt, etc. And there is evidence, right, that debunking, in the positive column, there is evidence that debunking and fact checking does work, is that people don't double down as much. But so that's the positive news. Debunking works. You can convince people of that. But I think the concern from scholars and other folks is that, people who say conspiracy theories are the root cause of our politics, it's more like conspiracy theories are a side effect. And in fact, when you correct these things, that, we don't see it change to, oh, well, actually, the FBI should be trusted or all these other things, right? We don't see that change afterwards. And so it's not, conspiracy theories are, a side effect of this deeper, I would say, polarization that's happening within the kind of folks that care a lot about politics, the political elites in our country. And so I think fact checking, we have to keep doing it, but we don't think that's going to be the switch that automatically reduces polarization.
Right. And nor should we expect that people will view nasty political actions differently if they learn, or if they're somehow convinced that what they had believed is false, they will sort of reaccommodate their positions in conspiracy theorists would.
Yeah, I mean, I think the general view is that, people will reduce their support for Trump when they find out negative things, even among his supporters, but that's not the basis, of their support. It's this deeper kind of adherence, this deep story about, the liberal left are out to destroy America and come after people like you and me.
And in your experience, is that true about liberals? Is that what they're trying to do?
No comment. No.
Very good. No comment. Okay, let's have questions if people have questions. That's the gentleman in the back.
Yeah. So those are great questions. I would say the first part that you talked about, the kind of context, how does that play a role? It's super important, right? And I'll give you an example. There was a politician in Ukraine. His name is Oleg Lashko, and he's actually, his image, I had to change it, was going to be the original cover likeness of the book, but did not want to get sued in Kiev court for that. But so he's a fascinating character. He's very much a populist. He ate dirt on the floor of the Ukrainian parliament. He's involved in I think a third of all fights that happened in the Rada were either directly instigated by him or other people. He calls folks skotinja, which means like an animal bastard, and he's known for that. So if you say that word, people are like, oh, Leshko. And he was sort of seen as a clown in Ukrainian politics. And then when the Euromaidan protests in 2013, 2014 broke out, he started going down there. He had a film crew. He eventually formed his own militia. He went to the east in Donbass. He beat people up on camera. His militia is accused of war crimes, assassinating Russian separatists. And he ends up finishing third in the 2014 presidential election, has his own party, the radical party of Oleg Lashko. And then, he's a player in Ukrainian politics. And then by about 2019, people started getting tired of it. And he ends up, his party doesn't even clear the threshold of 5% in the elections in 2019. He loses his home seat, and he ends up going to Kiev Borsipol International Airport and with a camera crew in tow to confront Zelensky's energy minister and actually throws him up against a wall. And then he had another special election and he still lost in his home district. So I think there was a shelf life, right? In 2014, people liked, the fact that he was a tough guy and he was going, doing his thing. But by 2019, the Lashko charm, if you want to call it that, had worn off. And so I think that's, context definitely matters for this. And there are times, particularly threat, where people want sort of strong and tough. And I think that's, and what was your second question was? Yeah. So I think the big so there were, when I did a survey of 190 political, experts, political scientists, and people who study political violence, they pointed out two types of rhetoric that were most concerning. One is dehumanizing language, calling opponents animals, and the second one was the use of incitement or direct calls for violence. And I would say in my book, I talk about the really worrying part is not so much when somebody like Lauren Boebert or Marjorie Taylor Greene do it, because they're kind of, unfortunately moving more towards the center of the party, but still they're kind of on the fringes, they're backbenchers. But when it comes from party leaders, that's the concerning part. And it's not so much that persuades people, is that it's more of a coordinating device. And those are the really scary things. And I think if you look at Trump's rhetoric, right, the concern about January 6th was some of the language that he used, but also he gave people a time and place and said, be there and be wild. And then the coordinating part of it was just as concerning. There.
Yes.
I have some thoughts. You want to go?
Well, actually, just because I wrote about this today, and again, in the context of this Romney thing, I went back and looked at the U.S. Capitol Police. There had been this reporting in 2021 about the surge in threats that were being investigated by the Capitol Police, something like 3,000 in 2017, and then it steadily increased till it was over 9,000 in 2021. It fell back down to about 7,000 last year after, obviously Donald Trump was out of office. But in its assessment of what was happening, one of the things they pointed out was the advent of social media. And obviously, social media existed prior to 2017, but certainly social media has changed over the course of the last 5 years. And one of the things they said is, the anonymity that comes with social media emboldens people to make these sorts of threats, whether or not they actually intend to do it, and that you can't arrest your way out of that. That's the actual quote from the psychologist from the Capitol Police. And that just struck me. I mean, I think it's very easy to point to social media as one of these conduits, but there's no question that social media played a role in January 6th, right? I mean, Donald Trump did his incitement on, as a tweet. And there's been all sorts of these assessments of the role that social media played in the lead up to that. So we certainly can point to actual factors that social media has played a role over the course of the past several years. But
yeah, so I let Philip go first because I have a slightly different take.
Please.
I think man. No, we're you both experts. And I think so. I agree with him is that the social media as a coordination function is really important. But I think a lot of people, and it would be nice, right, if the root cause of a lot of our polarization, was the idea that, our democracy was hacked. It's Facebook, it's Twitter or X, that's causing a lot of our dysfunction. But if you look at the data, the people that have polarized the fastest, and this is, the people, who are the Philip's talking about, the baby boomers, right? Their cable, it's partisan cable news. That's, having a way bigger impact than social media. And there was a bunch of studies that just came out about the effects of asking people to deactivate all these other things. And there were some positive things, right? People's personal mental health improved and all these other things, but it didn't really change polarization. So I think, social, there has been some effect, right? When Trump was banned, there was a decrease in hate speech, and there were definitely effects from targeted deactivations or account suspensions of people purveying hate, right? I think that's true, but I don't think social media is at the root of a lot of the issues that Philip and I have been talking about today.
And let me be very clear: if the question had been which do I think is worse, Fox News or social media, I don't think I would have chosen social media.
Yeah,
at least in terms of that. Okay, other questions? Should we talk about Mr. Zelensky's career prior to his presidency very quickly, since that was something was raised earlier?
Sure. Volodymyr Zelensky, I think it's, he's definitely emerged as a wartime hero in Ukraine. And I think it's kind of, it's wild to sort of think about. In 2019, I remember talking to one of my good friends who runs a survey company that did a lot of polling. And one of the things that they found is that every time he opened his mouth on policy, his numbers slipped. And so they were like, just record the funny videos of you walking in Kiev with former members of your comedy troupe. And, it kind of worked because Ukrainians were fed up with corruption, right? They saw him as somebody who wasn't going to be as bombastic as Petro Poroshenko, the previous president. And he kind of rode to wave. And the concern is that he was going to basically be a paper tiger who was going to fall, and wasn't going to be able to hold strong in negotiations. And I think it's kind of, wild that in fact that he is risen to that occasion. And I encourage you. There's a lot of really interesting pieces out there about Zelensky, but yeah, he's a fascinating politician.
And I'll just say the very first episode of his TV show was about how he had filmed this video in his classroom. He was supposed to be a teacher on the show, railing against the elites and the oligarchs and so on and so forth. And that went viral. Then all of a sudden he became this contender. So basically the show, and then he ended up winning the presidency in the first episode of the show. The show was basically that as well.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I mean, I will say two kind of comparison cases is so when in Brazil, when sort of supporters of Bolsonaro run their Congress, right? The interesting thing to see what happens is the reactions from members of Bolsonaro's own party that they turned against him. They kind of, they were basically saying this is our January 6th, but we're not going to let it happen like what happened in the US. And he's in big political trouble there. And I know in Israel, there was concerns, especially with Netanyahu's court cases and other things, that, members of the Israeli security service were like, basically, we want to prevent our own January 6th from happening. So I think, unfortunately, the a lot of the things that the international aspect of how people view U.S. domestic politics is through now January 6th is seen as, oh, the U.S. is not as different as we thought. And I think especially if you look at some of the foreign coverage of what happened on January 6th, I think it points to it as well. Yeah, I mean, so I mean, there's and I do think it was seen as cliche when like Michelle Obama, when she said when they go low we go high. I think that is generally popular, right? I think the concerning part is that where this rhetoric is effective is in the primary. And John Sides, Lynn Vavreck have this great book, and they show how much unearned media Trump got in the 2016 primary. And so I think in the general election, that definitely costs it costs votes. I think Philip talked about it, I talked about it, but the problem is when this is happening a lot of times in the primary or talking about in safe districts, the audience may not be like somebody who's a persuadable voter. And so I think that makes it tricky. I mean, I do think democracy and civility and not promoting incitement was actually a pretty big reason why Biden was elected. He was seen as not Trump, and that helped a lot. But I think it's trickier. I think it's the big question is, how do you change the elite incentives within the Republican Party to support this? And I there are people have tried to talk about changing the primary system, having a top two, right? Ranked choice voting. There are all these things that basically are designed to not reward this kind of rhetoric. But it's not. I think it's hard. It's hard.
Yeah, and I will say the one time that Donald Trump looked vulnerable in the 2024 presidential nominating fight was immediately after 2022, when there was a very effective way to point to the results of the election and say, Donald Trump did this, his extremism did this, this is why we keep losing. And then it fell apart for a variety of reasons, including the fact that he got indicted and people were able to rally around him.
It's a coordination problem, right? It's like among like elites, and it's who's going to be the first one to move, and we found out it's not going to be Ron DeSantis, probably. Yeah.
Right. No, I think that's true. That's true. Okay, I think we have time for one more if someone else has a question. Otherwise, I have a question. Okay. Oh, there you go. Please.
I mean, I would say, I think, and I'll just say, like, from like the academic perspective, something that, I've, always believed, but like have had to hide it in academia because we have these subfields. Like, you study countries outside the US, I study US politics. And if you talk to people who study US politics, they'd be like, there's a very orderly way of politics happening, right? The bill gets passed if it, has enough votes to override, the veto within the Senate, and it has the support of the president. Does it have a presidential override? Right? There's this very orderly view of American politics that was, pervaded, I would say, especially before 2016. And I would say what to me is that I think that's kind of a naive view of American politics. Contention has always been a part of American politics. I would say the unusual part of this is essentially that this was our first go round with a populist, president who really wanted to smash things. In other countries, Italy had Berlusconi, right? Turkey still has Erdogan. Israel has Netanyahu. in India, you talk to people about Modi, right? This is not, we are not as different maybe as we think. And, oh, sorry, go ahead. I mean, we could have a whole another topic about, I think most political scientists think the bully pulpit doesn't really exist, right? Like being able to like speak your way and speech your way into like popular support. It's hard, right? I mean, there's media coverage, there's narratives, there's shifting coalitions. I think it's hard. And I think, most of our survey evidence would suggest that Trump's, constant need to tweet and speak hurt him. I mean, if he were able to like tone it down, right, he probably would have been reelected. That's my guess.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I mean, it's also the case that both 2020 and 2024 are shaping up to be referendums on Trump. And so Joe Biden won in 2020 in large part because everyone who didn't like Trump was very motivated to come out and vote against him, which is why Joe Biden ended up getting so many votes. So we are about out of time. Is there anything that we should say about the book that we did not cover here that you think is perhaps the best selling point? The reason that if people are still sitting here like, I don't know if I should get this book, what is the thing that you should say to them in this moment?
One of my colleagues said there are more swear words in this book than any other academic book. So if you enjoy that, it's spicy.
Cussin is the answer.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everybody. Excellent. Appreciate it.